Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're doing well. Today I'm excited to share the process of painting this adorable raccoon in acrylics. This piece is actually my latest full-length class over on my Patreon, where you can paint along with me in real time. Over there I go much more in depth, showing my full palette work, mixing every colour from scratch and explaining each step in detail as we go. But in this video I'll be walking you through a condensed version of the process, showing tips along the way and giving you a basic overview of how I brought this chap to life. So without further ado, let's get started. For this painting I'm using golden heavy body acrylics, and I like to keep my colour palette fairly limited because I do prefer to mix the exact shades I need from just a handful of paints. For this piece I've started with Mars Black, Titanium White, Ultramarine Blue and Raw Umber. So once I have the background all blocked in and the outlines sketched out, I begin by working on the eye. I'm using a number 4 round brush to map out the really dark areas, leaving just a small space for the reflections. And for those shiny highlights I've added a mix of ultramarine blue and white. I'm also blocking in the lower eyelids with a mid-grey mix to establish the basic structure of the eye. The eyes are quite dark and in shadow, so I'm not too worried about the perfect definition or final details at this stage. Now moving on to the fur on the face. Raccoon fur is incredibly soft, so from the start I really wanted to capture the smoothness in my brush strokes as I built up my layers. When choosing colours I looked for the darkest shades that I could see within each section of the face, and these became my base layers. At this stage I wasn't too worried about getting the perfect colour. That came a little later. The goal here was just to get a solid foundation down and to cover the white of the canvas. So it was really important for me to work quickly during this part because, as you can see, after placing down each section of fur, I went in with a small mop brush while the paint was still wet to softly blend those sections together, and this helps to create those soft edges rather than harsh lines. And because acrylics dry so fast, I had to move quickly to make sure everything blended smoothly. I did run into one instance where the paint dried too soon, but I just reapplied it in those areas and blended again just to fix the transition. I also introduced some soft stripes on the raccoon's forehead to start defining that classic raccoon pattern. So for most of the fur I only used a couple of brushes, both of them round brushes for detailing. I really like the Calia range from Willow Wool for painting fur, and if you're interested I'll leave a link in the description to the exact ones I used. I next started by adding small details under the eye, just tiny strokes to build up the structure of the shorter fur in that area. Again, I wasn't too concerned about getting the exact colour at this moment, as I plan to introduce glazes later on, which you'll see in a little bit. So I went for some simple titanium white, maybe a little touch of Mars Black in there so we kind of have a light grey, but it really doesn't matter as long as it's a really light colour. I also added a tiny touch of water to dilute the paint, so the layers I applied were ever so slightly transparent, just for building up the depth in the layers. As I moved away from the eye, I began to use longer brush strokes, paying close attention to the direction of the fur. I made sure my strokes followed the natural contour of the bone structure, gently curving them where needed. The same approach applied to the upper eye area as well. While it can be quite tempting to dive straight into the details, it's really important to take your time and carefully build up the structure of the fur. Accuracy isn't just about getting the fur direction in place, but also about getting the length of those strokes right as well. So this is one of those key areas where my fur strokes were really short to replicate that really short fur. I also started to splay out my paint strokes into the surrounding fur, just so I could make a start on the transition between where the colour of the fur changed. So instead of working on one section at a time, I decided to tackle the whole head all at once, working on each part simultaneously. Here you can see I'm starting to map out the direction of the white fur. I'm using slightly longer brush strokes as well, and you'll notice that I'm being really careful with not just the direction of the fur, but also how it curves around the head. I'm also using my small mop brush every few strokes. This is before the paint dries, by the way, just to keep the underlying strokes nice and soft. So here's a small tip: when you're softening fur with a mop brush, just make sure to use a super light pressure, and by super light I mean really, really light. We're not trying to move paint around here, we're just trying to give it that really subtle soft touch. So after mapping out the fur on the head and the muzzle, I started to introduce my first glaze, and this was really just to darken the fur on the black cheeks. I mixed some Mars black with a little bit of raw umber to create a dark but warm tone of black, and then just a touch of water, not too much, just enough to dilute the paint slightly so it's semi-transparent. Then that way we can still see the underlying brush strokes. And I simply washed this mixture over the cheekbone areas and then took my time refining some of the details around the eye. I was careful with where I applied my brush over those tiny strokes, sometimes adding a little bit more paint to darken certain areas and sometimes keeping the paint semi-diluted to maintain lighter details underneath. All the while I'm using my small mop brush to soften the edges and eliminating any harsh stop lines and sharp marks that we don't want. After the first glaze, I started to introduce some more fur detailing, this time being a little bit more precise and deliberate with my brush strokes. At this point I also began applying the initial fur direction in the white areas, using a darker colour this time to create the shadows that naturally fall into the depths of the white. And then from there I started building up the layers across the head, focusing on refining the fur with lighter paint strokes. You can see here that I'm gently overlapping the raccoon stripes with those white fur strokes. I'm not eliminating the stripes completely, I'm just adding a slight overlap to blend them in. I then moved down to the nose area, still applying a light coloured paint, but using small gentle strokes to capture that short, tighter fur on either side of the nose and also down onto the muzzle. This area is really prominent, so I wanted to make sure that I captured it precisely, especially since the fur here is so short. I did spend a little extra time getting the fur direction just right. It's quite a delicate process, but those tiny precise details really help to make the piece feel quite lifelike. Next I introduced my next glaze, this time mixing a light brown caramel tone using raw umber and yellow ochre. Again I added just a blob of water to help with the consistency and the transparency of the paint, just enough to allow me to see those underlying colours beneath the glaze. Then I simply glazed over the warm caramel tones in the fur and followed it with some more detailed white strokes to build up additional layers and bring out more depth with the details. Moving on to the nose, it's a pretty dark area with some heavy shadows, but I still wanted to capture that glossy shine and the subtle blue tones that I could see in the reflection. So I started with a cool grey base layer, mixing some black, titanium white and then adding a touch of ultramarine blue just to tint the grey to make it a cooler grey tone, which you can see I'm mixing right here. Next I focused on blocking in the darkest areas like the nostrils and the lightest areas such as the reflection before glazing everything with a darker layer to add more depth. And then to finish it off I tidied up the nose with some gentle dabs of my brush, highlighting not just the tiny reflections but also bringing out the textured dappled surface of the nose as well. Then I added some further colour with some more dulled down blue glazes, using my small mop brush to soften any harsh dabs, so to speak. And then finally I refined the details with some touches of black and polished it off with some really tiny dots of titanium white just to bring out those brightest spots. The final few layers here are pretty repetitive with lots of refining details and adding small glazes to tint the colour. Sometimes I use my mop brush and other times I add more translucent linear strokes of paint. I'm constantly switching from darks to lights to build up the depth of the fur. As I move towards the top of the head I switch to a larger round brush, and this is where I started to use a little less paint on my brush. I made sure to wipe off the excess on a paper towel, so I only had a really small amount of paint to swipe onto the surface. I didn't want any bright opaque brush marks, and this technique allowed me to capture those really soft wispy hairs, which really helps to emphasize that delicate soft texture that I was looking for. The ears followed a similar process to the fur, starting by blocking in the lights and darks and softening the transitions with my mop brush. Then I went straight in with some pure titanium white to define the fur direction, making sure to use long brush strokes to emulate the long fur, and then after that I added some brown glazes to push those hairs into the depths, just creating an extra dimension before adding further layers and glazes to build up even more depth to the fur. At this point I also worked on overlapping the ear areas with the head area, carefully applying the brush strokes over both so that they blended seamlessly together. This is one of the challenges of working on small sections at a time. It just adds an extra task of making sure that the areas actually blend together so they don't look like isolated segments. Now I'm not going to go into too much detail with the body, but I made sure to start with the most prominent colours as a base layer. So for the warmer areas on the left, I mixed a 50-50 combination of yellow, ochre and raw umber, and then for the lighter side on the right, I created a lighter version of that mix by adding some titanium white. So once the first layer had dried, I did go back in with a second base layer, because as you can see, the first one left a streaky appearance with some of the canvas showing through. So it just needed a few minutes to dry before applying that second layer. So following a similar process to the head fur, I mapped out the fur direction using a translucent light paint. This time I applied thicker brush strokes and almost immediately softened them with my mop brush to create that soft, almost out of focus look for the lower layers. The key to achieving fur softness is to keep each and every layer soft as you build them up, because it all builds up as you go along. After that I added some more glazes, mainly warm brown glazes, so I did use a lot of raw umber here, and then I layered in some more detailed lighter strokes to build up the detail and the fine texture of the fur. I left the paw until the end because apart from the head is the part that seems to be the most at the forefront. So by leaving it until last, it meant I could finish off with the final details by overlapping the already completed areas. So just to rewind a little, the paw has both dark shadowed areas and sunlit sections. So I started by applying 2 adjoining base layers and softened them with a mop brush. After adding some light strokes to map out the fur direction, I made sure to overlap my details into this dark shadowed corner, which is almost like a triangular shape that we see here. I knew I was planning to add glazes to push those details further into the darkness, not eliminating them, just darkening them so you can still subtly see the details in the darkest shadows. Once everything was in place, it was just the usual stepping back, casting my eye over the whole painting and making sure I had those final few tweaks and adjustments in place. All in all, this was a really pleasant painting to work on, and I hope you like the finished result. If you'd like to create your own version along with me, you can subscribe to my Patreon, where the full class is available with my narrated instructions to paint along with. I hope you've enjoyed watching, and thank you so much for being here. Have a great day!